Gandhi is the director of the M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence in Memphis, Tennessee, and is the grandson of M.K. Gandhi, who led India to independence through his nonviolent social change.
Did you know your grandfather very well?
Yes, I was very lucky. I had the opportunity of living with him when I was 12 years old in 1946, and I have some very vivid memories of that time. And now in retrospect, I am always very puzzled how he could manage to divide his attention to so many different things at different levels. For instance, with me, he was absolutely grandfather, like any other grandfather, would play games with me, and we would tease each other and give me lessons and look at my lessons and all those things. And yet, the next moment, he would switch over and go to negotiations for the independence of India with the British leaders and other leaders there. And yeah, when I think back at all those little things that happened during that period, I really feel very happy that I was given that opportunity, because I think in many ways that 1 year, more than a year that I had with him, helped me understand his philosophy and mold my life and thinking as an adult. He had this knack of explaining his philosophy using minor everyday occurrences. I can share a few of them with you. Yes, one of them related to a little pencil. And now you'll wonder what a little pencil has to do with the philosophy of nonviolence, but I was given a pencil and a notebook to do my lessons with, and one day, like most children, I threw away the pencil when I thought it was too small. Went to grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, and he says, he started questioning me. Where is the pencil you had in the morning? Why do you need a new pencil? Why did you throw it away? And all sorts of things. And I couldn't convince him that that was too small. Ultimately, he told me to go out and look for the pencil. And so I used the excuse. I said, it's getting dark outside. It's late in the evening. So he says, here's a flashlight. And so he made me go out and look for that pencil for nearly 2 hours and bring it to him. And then he made me sit next to him, and he said, now I'm going to explain why I did this. And he said, I want you to learn 2 lessons from this. One is that even in the making of a little pencil, a lot of natural resources of the world are used. And if all of us, millions of us, go around wasting pencils like this, imagine how much of the natural resources we are wasting. And we have no right to do this. Now it amazes me that he was thinking about environment and ecology in 1945-46, when that wasn't even an issue. I don't think even anybody knew the word environment and ecology. But that was one lesson that he wanted me to learn. He says, however small or however insignificant it may seem to you, never get into the habit of wasting things and destroying things. Use it to the ultimate. The other lesson was that there were millions of children around the world who lived in such abject poverty that they didn't have even these little things to use there. So we ought to be doubly careful about all the things that we get and we are privileged to have, so that if we don't waste, we would be able to share with many more people.
What kinds of things did your grandfather like to do for fun, like the games you would play? What type of things would make him laugh, for instance?
Oh, he would laugh at many things. He had this great sense of humor, and I remember when we used to go out for walks in the morning and evenings, and he always had the habit of keeping 2 people close to him, and he would lean on their shoulders, keep his arms on their shoulders and walk that. And very often, just while walking, he'd suddenly lift up his legs and hang on your shoulders. And if you're not aware of this and you're taken by surprise, you could collapse on his way. But He would play such games. Sometimes he had a walking stick along with him, and I would be holding the stick in front and playing horse, and he would be sort of running after me, riding, and all very commonplace games. But he had a great sense of humor. I know when we used to sit and spin, very often we used to sit and spin together, the hand machine, spinning cotton.
Which was part of his philosophy, being independent from Britain.
Right. He wanted the people to produce their own cloth and use it, so he used to do that. And very often when he was spinning, I would find myself free and I would join him, and then we would have a competition to see who spun the thinnest yarn and who spun the most yarn in 1 hour and all those things.
Did he talk much, or did he tell you about some of the things that were happening in his life at the big level, national and international level?
Sometimes he would talk about it, not directly alone with me, but when we sat in a group or something, and he would express some of his feelings about it. But I guess I was too small at that time, 12 years old, for him to confide in me or anything like that.
In terms of the political. How did you become aware that this was your grandfather's philosophy, that nonviolence was the key to social change?
Well, during that year I saw how he used the philosophy and how he taught people, and he would teach me also using everyday instances. But it was never like a lesson. It was never, when you sit down and he lectures to you or anything like that. It was just in the course of the day when things were happening, he would use any particular instance and then give you a little story on that and tell you why that is important in his philosophy and all. So that's how I got some of the basic training. But I was fortunate that my parents, my father was his second son, and my mother, they had devoted their lives to his work in South Africa. And so they were conducting the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in a non-violent manner. So I got much of the later training through them. And then, of course, I used it myself in several situations, and I found that it was very practical. So I would say that it was a gradual process that went on over the years, and I just began to learn and appreciate more and more of his philosophy.
Did his death have a big impact on your life? Did it change it much?
Yeah, it was very shocking. I mean, when it came so suddenly, and I couldn't imagine anybody wanting to kill a person like him. I mean, it was unthinkable, and when that news came to me, I just couldn't believe it. None of us could go for the funeral, and Father was very disturbed by that. But we used to bring out a weekly newspaper called The Opinion. It was a paper that was started by grandfather in 1903.
Right, he had experiences earlier in South Africa.
So Father decided to bring out a special issue on commemorating grandfather, and we all got involved in that. And since this was a self-operated, hand-operated printing press where we had to pick up the alphabets and set them A, B, C, D and make the words there, I got my grounding in this printing press at a very early age, and I started helping in various ways. So by 14 I was already quite into it and able to help my parents bring out this weekly paper.
And so you ended up then staying in South Africa for the next years.
And my father died in 1956, and I went to India after his death to immerse his ashes in the rivers in India. And there I met my wife, and we decided to get married. the South African government said that I can come back alone, but I can't bring my wife with me.
Oh my goodness.
There were two main reasons for this. One of it was that they were always very keen on getting rid of the Gandhi family from South Africa because they were a thorn in their flesh. And they felt that this was a good opportunity because father had just died and I was the only male member. And they thought that if they didn't allow me to come back, then my mother and my two sisters would follow me to India and they would be rid of the family. But I guess they didn't count on the resilience of the Gandhi women. They decided to stay on and continue with the work in South Africa.
At that time in South Africa, were the people from India treated differently from the blacks in South Africa? They were put into a separate category, were they not?
Yeah, they really perfected this divide and rule policy in South Africa, and so the Indians, the black Africans and the coloreds, the mulattoes, who were classified as coloreds, everybody was treated separately. Everybody had different set of laws, but everybody was generally treated as a non-white. The South African system was classified into 4 categories. The first were the whites, and the whites were of 2 types. There were the British descendants and the Afrikaner descendants. The Afrikaner were slightly more in number, and for many years they had been subjugated by the British, so there wasn't very good relationship between them either.
Well, the British had defeated them in the Boer War.
Yeah, right.
They were of Dutch ascendancy, I understand.
But right up to 1948, the British controlled South Africa. And 1948 was the first time the Nationalist Party, made up of Dutch people, came into power. So they were the first group. And then came the coloreds. The coloreds were the mulattoes, the mixture of blacks and whites, or the Malays. In Cape Town they had imported a lot of people from Malaysia. And so there was a mixture of them with the whites, and a mixture of many other races with whites there. So they were all classified as coloreds. So they came in the second group. The third group were the Indians, and the fourth group were the local African tribes.
Now, where did the Asian people, the Chinese, the Japanese, you said the Japanese were honorary whites. Yeah. Where did the other Asians come in?
They all were all in the same group as the Indians. There were not too many of the other Asians there.
The Japanese were in a higher category than the Chinese or the Koreans?
Yes, that was for trade purposes. They had a lot of trade with Japan, so they couldn't discriminate against them, so they treated them as honorary whites. That was the classification given to them, honorary whites.
Do you remember any particular experiences there that were...
Yes, I was. In fact, like my grandfather, I suffered a lot of discrimination and beatings, physical beatings, because of color. In South Africa, you experience hate and discrimination and oppression almost at every step when you're walking down the streets, and anybody could insult you. You know, I remember one instance. I was sitting in the car waiting for my father to return, parked on the side there, and it was very close to a bar. And a white walked out from there swaggering. He was drunk. He was clearly a hobo. He didn't have anything to do. And he comes around to me and he says, "Hey, give me a bob. That's a shilling." So I said, "I'm sorry." And the fellow started insulting me. And there was a policeman standing nearby, and I told the policeman, I said, "Look, this fellow is harassing me here, and I don't like it." So the policeman turns around on me and he says, "If you don't like it, get out of here. What are you doing here, sitting here for?" He doesn't tell that man anything, but he tells me to get out from there. You know, that sort of thing is all the time. You just have to bear with it or keep fighting it.
And what about organized struggle? Were you involved in a movement for social
Yeah,
change?
my father was involved in movements, and as I said, we family members were always involved with our parents in various aspects of the movement. So we did defy. Of course, I was still young, so I wasn't taken to prison, but my father was taken to prison very often, and I think he spent about, in all, about 16 to 17 years of his life in prison.
Well, like Nelson Mandela, the same sort of arresting the leaders of the movement. And
except that it wasn't at one stretch, it was at different times.
Right. And what types of things would he be accused of doing? What did he do?
Well, he just defied apartheid wherever he saw it.
Plus his newspaper, I guess.
Plus his newspaper, plus writing in the newspaper.
Were there multiracial, multicultural organizations which were forming to try to provide this front against the apartheid?
Yeah, not until the 60s, no, not the 60s, I think in 52. Around 52 was the first time when the African National Congress, the Indian National Congress, and the Colored People's Congress, three of them came together and held a common conference, and they said, let's make common cause and fight together instead of separately. And that was the first time they decided, but it didn't last very long, because they decided it was going to be a non-violent struggle, and then they couldn't find a common law that affected all three of them together, apartheid law. And so that was a big problem, and eventually when they did find one or two of them, and they went and defied those laws, the government played a very clever trick on them. They gave each group a different jail sentence. And the African group suffered the most. For breaking the same law, the African was sentenced to 1 year's hard labor. The Indian was sentenced to 1 month's hard labor. And the colored person was sentenced to 1 week or something like that, It was ridiculous, this thing. So very quickly they broke up that coalition. But loosely they continued to function together in a very sort of loose fashion.
How would you compare the caste system in India with apartheid in South Africa?
Well, it's the same thing, you see. Like in South Africa, the whites were the superior. It was always a vertical division of people, and the whites were at the top. And in India, the Brahmins were at the top, and then the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas and the Sudras. These were the four classifications. And so the whites, they're the coloreds, the Indians, and the blacks, and each one of them discriminating and oppressing those below them. So that's exactly what happened in India also with the caste system. The three upper caste people would always oppress the low caste, and it was. So I found many parallels in the situation there. I also found many parallels in the way the whole system was created to oppress people, and how that was perpetuated through all these years. Of course, in India it's been there for more than 2,000 years. Earlier in India, before the birth of Christ, there was this caste system, but there was mobility up and down. There was no rigid, blockages. And so a person at the very bottom of the ladder, if he or she had the opportunity, they could move upwards, or the person from the top could come down. And there was that freedom to move up and down.
Was that mainly by economic...
Yeah, caste system is based on professions. Mainly based on profession.
So it's fixed from family or generation to generation.
That's what happened around the birth of Christ 2,000 years ago, when we had who is described as a Hindu lawmaker, Manu. Whether he was a king or he was just somebody who made the laws, I don't know. It's not very clear there. But Manu laid down the laws around the time of birth of Christ, when he made caste hereditary. And he said, henceforth, your caste will be determined by birth. And that's where all the discrimination and oppression came in.
It freezes the socio-economic class hierarchy.
Right. So you couldn't do anything to get out of it. There was absolutely nothing you could do to get out of it, and that's where the whole thing, all the unpleasantness came in.
And it's still that way today.
It's still that way. Unfortunately, I think grandfather expected the government to abolish the system altogether, and help people to get over that thing. But what they ended up doing is they just made it illegal to discriminate against somebody on the basis of caste or religion or race or gender. The low caste people who were discriminated against, they had to go and prove to the police and the courts of law that they have been oppressed or discriminated. And these people didn't have the means, they didn't have the education, they didn't have the finances to do these things. And also, very often the person who oppressed them or discriminated against them was their employer. So they couldn't very well go and institute legal proceedings against somebody who's providing them bread and butter.
You'd also probably have to go up before a judge who was at a higher caste.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, all of these things put together, they never did institute any cases there. And so you go to India today and the Indian government will give you statistics to show that there are no cases of discrimination in India, because but that's only half the truth, because nobody has instituted the proceedings. So how can there be any statistics of cases there at all?
Did Nehru try to bust the caste system? Were there any progressive social changes under his rule? He was one of the lieutenants of your grandfather, who was taken to be one of the more progressive of the Indian socialist national and Indian nationalists for independence, and was quite a distinguished person, ruled India for a long time. Did he not make an effort to follow your grandfather's teaching in terms of eliminating the caste system, or was he a disappointment?
Well, I personally was very disappointed with him. I thought that he would do much more in this field to break the caste system there, but obviously he didn't do it. And I think the only reason I can find that is that at the time of independence, more than 99.9% of the government and the bureaucracy was made up of the two upper caste people, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. Nehru himself was a Brahmin, and so they didn't want to threaten their own existence, and so the only thing they ended up doing is, like I said, and putting it in the Constitution that they will have equal rights and they will not be discriminated. Just as we did with the blacks here in the United States, they were granted civil rights, but that was all. Now legally you can do all these things, but then to implement that in real life, it's very difficult. We see that in the United States also, and we see it in India, that we are not able to translate the law in everyday life there. So the actual integration of the people hasn't taken place.
Now, Indira Gandhi, for many years, was also the Prime Minister, the ruler, President of India. What's the relationship between your family and Indira Gandhi's family, and what is your sense of her, to the extent that she did or did not follow the legacy of your grandfather?
Well, first of all, let me say that she wasn't related to us in any way at all. In fact, she was very astute in misleading people, not only in India but outside, about this relationship. And let me explain this. The Gandhi that she married was a descendant from Iran, known as a Parsi. And they used to spell their name. They did have the family name Gandhi, but they used to spell it very differently. It was Ghandhy. And she changed it to the Hindu spelling of the name to confuse people, and she got that, you know, she was able to do that. And so a lot of people everywhere in the world today think that she was directly related to the Gandhi. So to that extent she used Gandhi's name, but unfortunately she didn't do anything concrete or progressive to implement his philosophy. I don't think she really believed in anything very much.
She was just a politician.
She was a politician, she was out for power, and she was one of those people who believed that Gandhi wasn't realistic, that his ideas of cottage industry and all that were outdated, and they were not the answer to India. But that was because they approached his philosophy dogmatically, and I think that was a great injustice to Gandhi, because he didn't expect anybody to follow him dogmatically. He wanted people to evolve from his philosophy and build up on that, and I think that although he did talk so much about cottage industries and things like that, but that he was talking in terms of the 20s and 30s India, and if he was living today, I'm sure he would have accepted many other things in his philosophy.
Now, when did you leave South Africa to return to India? What year? And you weren't allowed to go back to South Africa then? And so what were some of your experiences then in India? Was this in the 1950s?
Yeah, as I said, I left South Africa in 56 after my father's death, and we married in 58, early 58, and they wouldn't allow me to come back with my wife, so I decided to stay on in India. And I had to get a job as a journalist in Times of India. And then in early 60, both my wife and I decided that along with our normal work and livelihood, we ought to be doing some social work also to help people. So we began to get involved in things, and my wife got involved with the status of battered women in India and abandoned children. Both of these problems are very acute in India. We have lots of battered women and many abandoned children. And then from that we got involved in the low caste untouchables. And that's when we really started implementing some of grandfather's philosophies of nonviolence in helping these people. First of all, it was an experiment. We ourselves were not very sure whether this would work or not. We had heard it in theory, but we had never seen it in practice, so we decided to put it in practice. We adopted one village of more than 260 untouchable families, about 200 miles south of Bombay. And we had to spend a lot of time trying to get accepted by them. They had been exploited so much that they became suspicious of everybody. They didn't want anybody to come and exploit them further. So for several months we had to go every day and speak to them and you know, make our case to them. And ultimately they did accept us, and once they did, then we started taking them into confidence. As grandfather suggested, we started working out programs, what were the priorities that they needed and how could we help them in this. And it was very clear that economic stability was one of the prime importance there. So we had to find ways of giving them economic stability. Now, in 1960, these people were in such dire poverty that they had never eaten a square meal in their lives. They had just survived on scraps of food that they got from the garbage. They had never tasted milk in their lives. They had no clothes to wear. very often we would go to their little huts to visit them, and the women would talk from inside, not open the doors to us. And then we found that because they didn't have any clothes, they couldn't come out and speak to us. So that was the level of poverty that we found there. But we took advantage of some of the government programs. At that time the government was very keen on developing the dairy industry because there was big demand for milk in the cities. So they were giving liberal loans to people to buy animals and produce milk and sell that milk to the mother dairy and all that. So we asked these people to go and apply for those loans. But when they did so, the government refused, saying that you don't have any collateral.
Oh my.
And so we had to stand sureties for them, get them the loans, and they each got an animal per family. And that was the first time that they tasted milk, and that vision is still there in my mind, you know, when they first got the milk from the animal and they took the first sip. I mean, it was so, in a sense, it was, you know, pathetic that people, a common thing like milk was never given to some people. But it was a very moving experience. And then they began to sell that milk to the government, and that became an income for them. And from that we helped them develop an agricultural cooperative. And through these cooperatives, in about 8 or 9 years, we transformed the economic base of that village totally. They began to get steady income and a sizable income every month, and they began to eat well and you know, wear clothes and send their children to schools and all those things, and you could see that transformation in them. And then we induced them to save some money for various programs of their own, like medical facilities and scholarships and things like that. And then there was another big problem there in that whole area. You know, because of poverty, the agents used to come from the cities and buy young girls to take them away into prostitution. And they would buy these girls for $12 and $15, and they were gone, you know, at the age of 10, 12. They went and they never came back again. Of course, they told the parents that they were taking them to the city and going to give them jobs and all that in somebody's homes. But in actual fact, they were taken to prostitution. So we wanted to put an end to that. And we told these people, I said, now you must ensure that nobody reaches that stage of desperation that they have to sell their daughters into prostitution. And you set aside some money for that. And they did that. And they also created a volunteer group of young men who would scour around the villages in that area and see that nobody ever sold their daughters, and whenever anybody was in a desperate need of money or something, they would help them through this fund. So since 1973 they stopped the sale of girls in about nearly 200 villages in the neighborhood.
That's remarkable.
And not only that, but then, you know, we had inspired them all along that they should not become selfish, that once they have attained economic stability, they should be willing to help other people. So they are now doing that. They are very well off economically now, and in all these years the young people have gotten education and come back and are running their businesses very well. But they are also you know, helping other young people in the neighboring villages you know, set up economic programs there. And so this economic program of theirs is now expanded to about 300 villages and covers about 500,000 population.
That's remarkable.
And this is independent of the government of India, right?
Oh yeah, totally independent.
People organizing themselves.
Well, this was the beauty of Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence. It was a more positive philosophy, not just a protest philosophy. It wasn't protest movement alone, but if you got involved in something, you didn't like something, do positively to change that, you know.
And create an alternative.
And create an alternative.
Right.
So that's where we really found the strength of this philosophy when we saw the results in this village and how in a very short time just 7 of us giving our part-time help, because all 7 of us had to work for our livelihood. The only thing we did was to sacrifice our vacation time and a little free time and go there and help them and advise them and do things for them. Apart from that, we didn't really do anything very much, but even that little help could transform the lives of so many people there.
What is the legacy of your grandfather today in India and around the world?
Well, I would say in many ways, in many senses, I think he's more respected outside India than he is inside India. Inside India, very few people now have the time to care for him except to exploit his name whenever it's necessary for whatever means. And it's very, very sad the way they do it. Little incidents in which I am involved very recently. I started this institute in memory of grandfather and my parents in Memphis, Tennessee. And I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of India, the present Prime Minister, asking him to donate through the government of India all the books written by and on Gandhi, the videotapes and the films and audio tapes and all the things that they have there. Please make a copy of it and give it to me so that I can keep it in this institute, and it will help in teaching young people the philosophy of non-violence. And I got a letter saying that he was sending it over to the relevant ministries and I will hear from them shortly. Well, I did hear from them a year later. And they said, we have passed all your requests. You can take all these things, but we don't have the money to mail it to you, to ship it to you. So you'll have to make arrangements to ship it. You'll have to make arrangements for somebody to copy all the films and the photographs and all that, pay for the copies. And so I said, okay, that's fine. I'll find some donor in the US who can do it. And then 2 months later, I read in the newspapers that the government of India has started a Nehru Center in London, and they've spent $3 million there to renovate the building and to spruce it up. And they're now shipping all the furniture required for that center from India at the expense of the government.
Your grandfather's philosophy represents a threat to the present-day rulers of India, as well as other oppressive governments all over the world. And they just do not want to support social movements and social activism that threatens the status quo. Whereas Nehru is a westernizer, a moderate politician, as he turns out to be, who is very pro-British in certain ways, as evidenced by the fact that in London they're having this center. So it's not terribly surprising. Let's conclude the discussion with talking about how you came to the United States. You were involved in the struggles in India that you told us in detail about to help the villagers and particularly the untouchable class and fight the caste system. What led you to leave India and to come to the United States?
Well, I had all these experiences in India and in South Africa, and especially in India, where I used grandfather's philosophy very effectively in bringing about these social and economic changes there. And I thought that that was something that I needed to share with other people. And there was an American friend who was visiting India. This was in 82, 83. And I just got to talking to him about this work, and he came and saw the work that we were doing and was very impressed by it. And while we were talking, the idea came into my mind, why not write a book comparing these attitudes in South Africa, India and the United States. One place you have the racial discrimination, in another place the caste discrimination, and in the third place the color discrimination. Compare this and find non-violent solutions to it and write a book on that. And he was very taken up by the idea, and he said, if you'd like to come to the US and do that, I could make it possible for you. So he arranged for a fellowship for 1 year to come here and do it. And that's how I came here in '87. And while working on that project in Mississippi, the media heard about me, and I started getting invited by universities to speak and all that. And so after the fellowship ended, we just extended our stay with this money that I was earning through speaking engagements, and at the same time working on the book there. And one thing led to another, and then in '88 my mother died, and that's when I went to South Africa to be by her side. And that was the first time I saw the Gandhi Institute in South Africa totally destroyed and demolished. It was a double tragedy for me. It was, on one hand, I lost my mother, and I see their life's work was all in ashes, you know.
Someone had burned it down?
Yeah, it was the government and the Inkatha together, you know, conspired to demolish it. So I was thinking of starting an institute for the study of nonviolence. Initially the idea was to do it in South Africa, sort of replacement of this institute that was destroyed, and just to you know, inform young people of alternative ways of dealing with conflicts there. But South Africa wasn't ready for it. They didn't accept the idea, and there were a lot of political hassles in '88, so I gave up the idea. And lots of my friends here in the academic world, they said, if you can't do it in South Africa, why don't you do it here? It's needed anywhere in the world. So I looked around here, and in the Christian Brothers University in Memphis, a very small university, heard about it, so they offered us some hospitality and said that they didn't have the money, but we could use the facilities, and I thought that was good enough. So I sold my grandfather's letters that I inherited from my mother. The original letters was a packet of about 67 letters. They were all right from 1892 to 1948. And they were getting old and brittle and you know, deteriorating very quickly. And I thought that I wouldn't be able to preserve them. So if I could raise some money from that, why not do that? And I did that last year. I auctioned them in London. But that auction caused a little controversy in India. The government of India accused me of commercializing Gandhi's name and all that. So the price of the letters fell. But I got $56,000, and that was invested in this institute, which is what we are working with now. But now a lot of people locally have heard about it, that they are very sympathetic, and they give us donations. So we have been working for the last 1 year in that institute, and I think we'll be able to do quite a lot of work there. One of the things that we want to take up immediately is 1994 is the grandfather's 125th birth anniversary, and I wanted to use that as a peg to declare 1994 as a year of nonviolence, to commemorate all the people all over the world who sacrificed for the nonviolent change, you know, and simultaneously have programs to inform people and educate people in nonviolent conflict resolution.
It's ironic that his home country has turned his back on him, but the rest of the world has really embraced him and his philosophy.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, that the rest of the world respects him and
how is this? How do you see this happening in various different parts of the world, the impact?
Well, I think it's been tremendous, and wherever I've been outside India, the interest in Gandhi and in his philosophy and all that has been tremendous, and we can see it in everyday life. I mean, the influences in Eastern Europe and all over the place, changes have been taking place in a non-violent manner, and much of that has been his influence, one way or the other.
And do you envisage participating in some nonviolent social change and activism projects in the United States? As you well know, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was deeply influenced by your grandfather's teaching. Do you see some contemporary projects that this might be applied in the United States?
One of the things that I want to do very soon is to hold a conference of youth. We see the youth having many problems. There is violence among the youth, and a lot of disaffection among the youth, and drugs and all that. Now, all of these things tell me that there's a lot of frustration among the youth. But we have never consulted the youth about it. It's always the experts, the adults, who analyze the problems of the youth and provide the solutions, and those solutions are not accepted by the youth, so things just get worse and worse. What I want to do is to reverse the process. To have this conference of the youth where the youth are going to talk. They are going to try to find some solutions. We can help them in whatever way they want to, but they must take the initiative and they must come up with the solutions there, and we adults must sit and listen to them. I think that's what we need to do in many things. In fact, this is what I've been trying to explain to many of the civil rights leaders and also people in Memphis, that we now have to change our focus from protesting to doing something positive. I mean, for long we have been protesting and protesting and protesting. Let's get down to doing something positive ourselves and not wait for the government to do things. Be careful about all the things that we get and we are privileged to have, so that if we don't waste, we would be able to share with many more people.
What kinds of things did your grandfather like to do for fun, like the games you would play? What types of things would make him laugh, for instance?
Oh, he would laugh at many things. He had this great sense of humor, and I remember when we used to go out for walks in the morning and evenings, and he always had the habit of keeping two people close to him, and he would lean on their shoulders, keep his arms on their shoulders and walk that. And very often, just while walking, he'd suddenly lift up his legs and hang on your shoulders. And if you're not aware of this and you're taken by surprise, you could collapse on his way. But he would play such games. Sometimes he had a walking stick along with him, and I would be holding the stick in front and playing horse, and he would be sort of running after me, riding, and all very commonplace games. But that I was given that opportunity, because I think in many ways that 1 year, more than a year that I had with him, helped me understand his philosophy and mold my life and thinking as an adult. He had this knack of explaining his philosophy using minor everyday occurrences. I can share a few of them with you. One of them related to a little pencil. And now you'll wonder what a little pencil has to do with the philosophy of nonviolence, but I was given a pencil and a notebook to do my lessons with, and one day, like most children, I threw away the pencil when I thought it was too small, went to grandfather and asked him for a new pencil. And he says, he started questioning me, where is the pencil you had in the morning, why do you need a new pencil, why did you throw it away, and all sorts of things. And I couldn't convince him that that was too small. Ultimately, he told me to go out and look for the pencil, and so I used the excuse. I said, it's getting dark outside, it's late in the evening. So he says, he has a flashlight. And so he made me go out and look for that pencil for nearly 2 hours and bring it to him. And then he made me sit next to him and he said, now I'm going to explain why I did this. And he said, I want you to learn 2 lessons from this. One is that even in the making of a little pencil, a lot of natural resources of the world are used. And if all of us, millions of us, go around wasting pencils like this, imagine how much of natural resources we are wasting. And we have no right to do this. Now it amazes me that he was thinking about environment and ecology in 1945-46 when that wasn't even an issue. I don't think even anybody knew the word environment and ecology. But that was one lesson that he wanted me to learn. He says, however small or however insignificant it may seem to you, never get into the habit of wasting things and destroying things. Use it to the ultimate. The other lesson was that there were millions of children around the world who lived in such abject poverty that they didn't have even these little things to use there. So we ought to be doubly... He had a great sense of humor. I know when we used to sit and spin, very often we used to sit and spin together, you know, the hand machine, spinning cotton.
Which was part of his philosophy, being independent from Britain.
Right. He wanted the people to produce their own cloth and use it, so he used to do that. And very often when he was spinning, I would find myself free and I would join him, and then we would have a competition to see who spun the thinnest yarn and who spun the most yarn in 1 hour and all those things. And
did he talk much, or did he tell you about some of the things that were happening in his life at the big level, national and international level?
Sometimes he would talk about it, not directly alone with me, but when we sat in a group or something, and he would express some of his feelings about it. But I guess I was too small at that time, 12 years old, for him to confide in me or anything like that.
In terms of the political... Yeah. How did you become aware that this was your grandfather's philosophy, that nonviolence was the key to social change?
Well,
Gandhi is the director of the M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence in Memphis, Tennessee, and is the grandson of M.K. Gandhi, who led India to independence through his nonviolent social change.
Did you know your grandfather very well?
Yes, I was very lucky. I had the opportunity of living with him when I was 12 years old in 1946. And I have some very vivid memories of that time. And now in retrospect, I am always very puzzled how he could manage to divide his attention to so many different things at different levels. For instance, with me, he was absolutely grandfather, like any other grandfather, would play games with me, and we would tease each other and give me lessons and look at my lessons and all those things. And yet, the next moment he would switch over and go to negotiations for the independence of India with the British leaders and other leaders there. And yeah, when I think back at all those little things that happened during that period, I really feel very happy